all right, everybody. I got really animated by these remarks that Huemer made about evolution in the last video. So I wanted to finish this up here and talk about this. And this time I brought some excerpts from the book itself. Goblin Lord, you're in for 1,000 lance loot. Sapir, you're in for 500. And Hudson, you're in for 250. And everybody else in the chat, Andrew Moy, Modern Moralist, Jonah, and Jacobian Ethics, and Biz Down Materials. All of you, nobody else, if anyone jumps in, you all get an extra bonus 100 lance loot because it's the season to be jolly. And I want you all to be jolly as we talk about the selfish gene and evolution and all that stuff. So get jolly. Is the season for jolliness. Let's do it. Also, I'm going to be getting jolly here because I have a beer. So I'll be drinking while doing this because why not? I'm actually going to go back to the start of the question about evolution. And this time, I'll get into what I'm going to be showing you. Yeah, Hudson says inflation is even hitting lance loot now. It's the season of jolly. You're getting a bit of a like a stimulus. So more humorous content. It's people always got to make the humor jokes. All right, so let's just get into it. Let's get into the video, and we'll get into what I wanted to show you. So let's just do it. And so we're starting back from where Huemer is first asked about the potential for evolution to account for morality. So let's do it.
Okay, I like your approach. Thank you so much. So now, some say that our moral intuitions and judgments can be fully explained by evolutionary psychology, that we have certain moral impulses because they helped our ancestors to survive and cooperate. So would that explain why we think that it's morally wrong to kill people from fun?
It's sort of and sort of not, right? Like, so you can come up with evolutionary explanations for virtually everything, right? So like you can come up with explanations for morality in the same way that you could come up with explanations for anything that happened. Okay, so
anticipating his remark a little later on about falsifiability, he says here, you can come up with an evolutionary explanation for just about anything. And that's certainly true. Kind of trivially true, though. You could come up with a supernatural explanation for anything. You could come up with a ridiculous natural explanation for anything. You could always say everything is actually like any given observation is a illusion. It's a trick that was conducted by scientists to fool us. Like anyone can propose anything as an explanation for anything. What matters is whether the explanations are good. So it is true that evolutionary psychological approaches get a bad rap for their propensity for many enthusiastic proponents of evolutionary psychology to take some observed phenomena, something among humans, and then wildly hypothesize about what might be the cause of it. But just because you could speculate about the evolutionary causes of a given behavior badly does not mean that evolutionary hypotheses are unfalsifiable. It doesn't mean that you couldn't in principle provide evidence for them. It doesn't mean that they're all equally as good as one another. It is possible to get evidence that supports one account over another. So he should tread cautiously here, because I don't disagree with the point that he's making here, that you could come up with an explanation for anything, but I'd caution that there are better and worse explanations, and I hope he would agree to that.
But could you come up with explanations that you would have anticipated before you knew what our actual moral beliefs were?
I think the answer to that is probably yes, if you're given enough additional information. So if the only thing you don't know is what our moral beliefs are, but you could look at other things. And this is where it gets a little weird, because a lot of the practices, like what would you be basing the prediction on? What information? Like the neurophysiology of a human brain? I mean, at least part of the problem is that humans are adapted to constructing cultures, and culture can shape what we do and how we think in ways that are not that readily predictable from merely looking at our genes or merely looking at human physiology. So to give some comparative examples, if you look at morphology, if you look at a bird, like without knowing anything about bird behavior directly, you just see the bird, you might go, yeah, I think that thing could probably fly. When you see the feathers and the wings and that sort of thing. If you look at something like a rhinoceros, you might think yeah, that thing looks pretty formidable. It looks like it could defend itself. So, depending on what you're looking at, you could make some inferences about the likely behavior of an organism based on its appearance. It wouldn't be much of a stretch to figure out if you just looked at a fish that it probably behaves by swimming around in the water. You might be able to tell whether something's likely to be a predator by looking at its teeth. There's various sorts of inferences you could make about behavior from looking at physiology. Now, when it comes to humans, nothing about our physiology is going to easily give away what kind of behavior we would engage in. So if we're limiting the information to that, yeah, you might not be able to predict human behavior, but that's not going to tell you a whole lot about it's not going to be too much of a hindrance to offering an evolutionary explanation because we can look at behavior. And in this case, what we do is we make retroactive explanatory accounts about what caused the behavior that we now observe. So if we had to make novel predictions, well, who knows? That's a difficult counterfactual. Conditional on a certain restricted set of information, what kinds of predictions could we, potentially make about human morality? I don't know, but I don't know that that's going to really be such a problem for offering a psychological explanation, because depending on the type of information you're restricting, it could just be that you're restricting precisely the kind of information you would need to make the appropriate kind of prediction. But in the case of humans, we already have human behavior to observe, and now we're making this explanation. Okay, why is it like that? And so we're not really making like novel predictions. We're not making discoveries about the behavior. Although I will say sometimes we are. Sometimes we will discover something that we might have thought was universal isn't by locating a human population where it's not present. You might discover that something is not it's not a product of a sort of evolved or innate developmental process, because actually, in the absence of certain sorts of cultural inputs, it doesn't arise. Although that's complicated, but because it could be that certain sorts of innate capacities are innate capacities that require a certain type of input in order to come online or activate or develop properly. So even that's complicated. A lot of this is very complicated. But I don't think that we're going to get a whole lot of traction on this question of could you predict? How would we know? We don't really have access to the counterfactual. We don't know the precise details of the counterfactual.
No, probably not. Okay. So, you learn from evolutionary theory that evolution selects for selfishness. This is what.
So he says here, you learn from evolutionary theory that evolution selects for selfishness. Now, the implication here is selfishness in presumably the behavior of organisms. That is, at the individual level, that natural selection favors animals like humans acting in a selfish way. We'll see what else he has to say before we get into what I have to say about this.
You learn if you read great books like The Selfish Gene. Okay. Basically, the group selection model is wrong. Evolution does not select for behaviors that benefit the group, right? It selects for behaviors that benefit the individual, or more specifically, that benefit the particular gene that's being selected.
So he says more particularly the gene, but he says the individual or more particularly the gene as if that's a sort of qualification on selection at the level of the individual. But that is not what Dawkins argues in The Selfish Gene. What he argues is that genes are the unit of selection and the organism is the vehicle of selection. So it's not that you can sort of clarify individual level selection is actually gene level selection. No, it's gene level selection. It's not selection at the level of individuals. So there's a slight implied inaccuracy there. But if selection operates at the level of the gene, where is he getting this idea that it favors selfishness at the individual level?
The genes tend to predominate in the population when that gene causes individuals who have that gene to produce more copies of it. Okay.
And that's fine. Yeah, that's true.
So now if you just understand that, then what you would anticipate from people's moral values is you would think that everyone should be an ethical egoist, right? Now, ethical egoism is a view in ethics that the right thing to do is always the thing that most serves your own interests. So you'd expect that people to have something like that view, or maybe, even more, you'd expect them to have the view that the good is reproduction. That everybody's main goal in life should be to produce as many offspring as possible.
So neither of these are things that you would predict if you understood natural selection and you were looking at the behavior of organisms. What you would predict is that organisms would be adapted to acting in a way that enhances their reproductive fitness, but it does not entail that any given organism that has goals, aspirations, or values, a sort of, you could say cognitively advanced organism, it doesn't entail the prediction that that is what they would explicitly and consciously aspire to or care about or moralize. That doesn't follow. You would have to ask the further question, would doing so optimize for their reproductive fitness? And it's not so clear that it would. If you look at animal behavior in general, there is zero indication that the way that animals operate is that they actively have this sort of operative goal of trying to optimize for their reproductive fitness. There's a couple caveats and qualifiers for that, but because sometimes organisms might actively bring about their own death in order to save kin. So take something like bees or ants, and there are other organisms. There's animals that make like warning calls that put themselves at risk of being killed by a predator, and they end up assisting or increasing the likelihood of the survival of their conspecifics, of other members of their species, often members of a family group. Why would they do this? Well, the modern account of evolutionary theory is not one that holds that organisms are exclusively motivated by a personal interest in their own survival and reproduction. Instead, there is a recognition that, just as Huemer put it, since the sort of goal, so to speak, from a gene level perspective is to get as many copies of yourselves in future generations as possible, those copies don't have to be through a direct, you could say, like vertical line through offspring. So the genes build an organism as the vehicle. And then you might think that, okay, so their only goal is reproduction, make copies of yourself. Well, you already have a problem, which is that most organisms rely on sexual reproduction. Why would they do that? Why would you engage in sexual reproduction when this results in having only, sometimes it's more complicated than this, but typically half of your genes in your offspring? Why not reproduce asexually? Well, there's this thing, the Red Queen hypothesis, and recombination and shuffling around your genes allows organisms to resist the spread of pathogens. So by constantly sort of rearranging your DNA, this can make you resistant to various sorts of pathogens and deleterious effects. There might be other reasons for why organisms would have reproductive, like engage in sexual reproduction and basically give up half their genes per offspring for various sorts of advantages that they could obtain from this. But the point here is that already the very act of sexual reproduction involves individual cooperation with other members of one's own species. Now, by cooperation, I don't mean like it has to be friendly. It could be adversarial. Some organisms actually kill their mates or die after mating. So it doesn't have to be this friendly sort of thing, but there's already an incentive from an adaptive perspective for, in certain respects, interacting with, getting along with, and cooperating, at least for certain sorts of activities like sex, for animals to engage in those sorts of activities. So that's already something before we even get into the fact that organisms are going to care about their offspring, not just themselves. They're going to care about close kin, not just themselves. So cousins are going to share DNA with you. And so it would make adaptive sense for an organism to give up its life to save 20 first cousins, because they're going to have a lot more copies of its genes distributed across those 20 cousins than it would have in itself. So this is the idea of kin selection. So already genes, from an adaptive perspective, should be expected to motivate behavior that is conditionally adaptive based on what would best serve the interests of getting the copies of themselves into future generations. And in certain environmental circumstances, in certain environmental circumstances relative to the conditions in which an organism is in, it may be in that organism's interest to be solitary, to mate only as necessary, to not be concerned about sacrificing itself for the welfare of others. There are solitary organisms, like tigers, I believe, are fairly solitary. There are other sorts of predators that might live fairly solitary lives. And it's unlikely for them in many circumstances to altruistically sacrifice themselves for the sake of other tigers or other whatever the organism is. However, there may be circumstances where, conditional on the rest of the characteristics, the rest of the phenotypes of the organism, it's actually in their interest to work together. And you see this all the time in nature. You see this in herd animals. Herbivores often work in large groups, and they will protect their young. They will protect other members of the group. You sometimes see this in predators as well. Pack hunting predators like wolves, dolphins and orcas will engage in fairly altruistic behavior towards members of the group. Well, why would they do this? Well, so long as a disposition to fight on behalf of and strive to protect members of one's group tends to promote having more copies of one's genes in future generations, then it will be selected for, it'll be favored by natural selection. And so anybody with a modicum of a remotely modern understanding of how biologists think about evolutionary theory would recognize this and be aware of kin selection and be aware that it does not predict selfish behavior at the level of the individual. What it predicts is that organism's behavior is going to be contingent on the rest of the adaptations that the organism has, and that for some organisms, it's going to be adaptive to engage in various types of altruistic behavior, and for other organisms, it won't be adaptive to do so. So maybe it's not adaptive for a tiger to do so, but it would be adaptive for an antelope or a penguin or ants or a variety of other organisms, and this can include humans. So that addresses at least one part of what he's suggesting here, and then the other part being this optimized for reproduction. But I keep having my throat mess up, so let me get a good pull. I hate when that happens. So, and then the other thing we were talking about yesterday is this question of like, well, shouldn't we value reproduction? That's all people should care about. Now, that's not typically how natural selection does what it does. So, the point I was making yesterday when I asked why do dogs eat? Well, dogs don't eat because there my throat is going again. The gods don't want me to talk tonight. All right. So, if you look at why animals do what they do it because they are motivated by various sorts of impulses or drives like hunger, thirst, lust, whatever the characteristic may be. But what you don't see is organisms just having this algorithm that says optimize reproductive fitness directly, optimize reproductive fitness directly. Reproductive fitness is optimized indirectly by motivating organisms to engage in activities that have the incidental effect of enhancing their reproductive fitness. And there's a whole suite of different behaviors that organisms will engage in. And the types of modifications to animal cognition that motivate behavior are going to be locally adaptive for the specific sort of thing. So, a tendency to be hungry and to enjoy the taste of foods that that animal's physiology it's able to metabolize. Not every animal can eat the right thing. So, it would be important for a predator. It'd be very maladaptive for a tiger to find grass really, really tasty because it wouldn't be able to digest it and it would die very quickly. It wouldn't be adaptive for a mouse to only want to eat like very large mammals like elephants because it wouldn't be able to kill them and eat them. So organisms are going to tend to want to eat things that they can metabolize, that they can procure effectively, and that's not achieved by them having this like overarching objective, optimize reproductive fitness. Now you might think, okay, fair enough. Animals operate that way, but humans have more than just instincts and drives. Humans have goals and values. So why wouldn't we value that? Well, man, this throat thing, I hate when this happens because I got this flow going and then I can't talk properly. Ugh. So hopefully it'll clear up at some point. I don't think it's going to. All right. So for humans, why wouldn't humans care about that? Well, what would that look like? So, okay, I have the goal of reproductive fitness. Okay, now what do I do? That's not a particularly helpful sort of thing. What humans did is that humans developed the cognitive capacities. I mean, certain things that we could figure out on our own, like trial and error, and we figure things out. But a big part of the way human cognition operates is that we evolved to be social organisms, to grow up in a group, and we optimize our reproductive fitness through learning how to extract resources from our environment from older members of our group. So we go through this very long period of development. We have a very long, vulnerable childhood in which we need a lot of caregiving for a very long period of time. We have this long period of learning. It takes us a long time to pick up language, to acquire the proper motor coordination, to survive on our own. So what humans did is they adapted to being cultural organisms. We are adapted to having cultures, to acquiring adaptive information from our culture. We're not super physically powerful. We do have some advantages. Humans can do endurance running. So we could, this is a method of hunting that you could use where you just chase animals until they just run out of energy. This is a technique that humans used today and they've used historically. So humans do have certain sorts of, like, we could swim, we could climb. Humans are pretty adaptive, and they're not physically totally inept. Don't let anyone tell you that, chimpanzees are way stronger than us. Tigers have a lot of physical advantages over us. Lots of animals have physical advantages over us. We're just big old losers and slouches from a physical perspective. We are not. We could throw things in a way other animals can't, and that matters. Hitting something with a rock from a distance is a pretty big advantage you can have over most other organisms. So humans have certain sorts of physical advantages, but that's not our main adaptive sort of like what sets us apart. What sets us apart is the ability to pick up information from previous generations, add to it, and pass that on to future generations. It's cumulative cultural evolution. And so humans are no longer just organisms where all the adaptations flow from and are a product directly of their genes. Instead, we operate both at the genetic level from an adaptive perspective and the cultural level. Our cultures shape our behavior and can lead to downstream effects on our DNA. So what I mean by that is, if a culture devises a new attribute or characteristic or ability, what that immediately does is it changes the selective pressures within that population such that receptivity or a lack of receptivity to engaging in the cultural practice can alter the reproductive fitness of organisms. So let's say humans create, let's say organisms were stranded on an island, like a population of humans. I don't know why I'm saying organisms. Humans are stranded on an island. Some of them take up fishing or like, deep diving to like get scallops or something like that. Those that have better lung capacity, that are better at swimming, they are going to have an adaptive advantage over ones that are worse swimmers or afraid of swimming. Let's say humans end up retreating into a high mountainous region. The ones that are less afraid of heights and are more willing to scale the mountain in order to get to new hunting spots, they're going to have an advantage. So as conditions change, the selective advantages change. Sometimes this is just features of where you happen to be, what your environment happens to be, but sometimes it could be a cultural change, like reading comes around, and people that are better at reading end up getting higher status positions within the culture. That high status gives them access to more or higher reproductive fitness mates, and they leave behind more offspring. So what you get is this feedback loop between genes and culture, where culture can shape the selective pressures at a genetic level, which then our genes correspondingly change, which when new cultural changes arise, it works in a loop. So the culture sort of domesticates or modifies the genes within a given population, and then new mutations arise, and the frequency of different alleles in that population change, and that in turn changes the opportunities and possibilities for what sorts of cultural changes occur. And then when they occur, it feeds back into changing the genes. And that's gene culture coevolution. That is how humans have developed so rapidly, how we've been able to expand around the world, how we're able to live, from all in deserts, mountains, by the sea, in cold and hot and rainforests and deserts everywhere. That's why. So that is the method that we use. Now, nothing about the process of enculturation to acquire norms is a process that would require you to have any specific set of values. Now, there certainly are certain sorts of predispositions and tendencies that humans are going to have for having certain sorts of values or certain sorts of norms within a community. It's not so clear how innate those norms are. So there are certain sorts of recurring patterns of what we see across different populations: an opposition to stealing, an opposition to wantonly killing others within your group for no particular reason, an opposition to just refusing to share resources and being super duper selfish. There's various sorts of incest taboos. Now, is that something that we're just biologically programmed to think? I don't know about that. So a lot of these sorts of things are things that, well, what is actually causing people to form the moral standards? It could be a reliably recurring predisposition to find incest gross, and then that increases the likelihood of having norms develop within a culture against incest, and then those become internalized and normalized over multiple generations, and that culture then reinforces those norms. So even if humans have a disposition to have certain sorts of attitudes or sentiments towards certain sorts of actions, culture, it may not be able to fully override. It's not like we are just total blank slates and culture can just make us think or care about anything. You're not going to get too many cultures that think like the rectangles are super evil, and if you see somebody have a rectangle on their shirt, you have to immediately kill them. Maybe it's possible under very weird conditions, like a super bizarre cult, to convince people of something like that. But people are going to have these fairly standardized, routinized types of dispositions and tendencies. But culture can shape them. People have engaged in human sacrifice. They've engaged in cannibalism. People have it's been standard practice in a society to slaughter children. So humans have had all sorts of behavioral differences that are radically different from modern, Western sensibilities. And so when contemporary Western philosophers report things like, it's obvious that you shouldn't murder people, was it obvious to ancient Greeks? Because they might have thought, well, but murder who though? Like the people over there? Because they might be like, they're fine with offing those people, just don't off people here. So, historically, a lot of populations had strong in-group, out-group attitudes, and they might not have cared that much about killing members of out-groups. So, it's not so clear that people historically haven't had the capacity for radically different moral standards and values. Now, I'm not saying that they're infinitely malleable, but they might be more malleable than people suppose. So what I really want to get back to, though, is the suggestion on Huemer's part that the selfish gene in particular, because he said, let's go back and have a look at that, because I've been talking for a long time.
That's being selected. So the genes tend to predominate for or could come up with explanations.
Intuitions and judgments can be fully
implausible about all the alternative views. It's doing something, right? Okay, so anyway, yes, that things wrong mean, right? Because sense of moral.
So would that
sort of not right? Like, so you can come up with evolutionary explanations for virtually everything, right? So like you can come up with explanations for morality in the same way that you could come up with explanations for anything that happened. Okay, so, but could you come up with explanations that you would have anticipated before you knew what our actual moral beliefs were? No, probably not. Okay, so you learn from evolutionary theory that evolution selects for selfishness. This is what you learn if you read great books like The Selfish Gene. Okay,
I want to pause there. You learn that evolution favors selfishness, and you get this from great books like The Selfish Gene. That's not true. So what I was saying in the previous video is that the selfish gene, there's a reason why it's called the selfish gene. And in his, so I have the 30th anniversary edition, and I have some quotes from the 40th anniversary edition I pulled up. They look like they're the same as the 30th anniversary edition. In there, Dawkins has a new introduction to the book where he addresses some of the myths and misunderstandings about what the selfish gene is about. And what I'm going to do is show you some quotes from that to show that what Huemer is saying here is not true, that it's not true that evolutionary theory predicts selfish behavior at the level of individual organisms. And it's certainly not true that the book, The Selfish Gene, was arguing that that's the case. Quite the contrary. What Dawkins emphasizes in that book is he has a remark where he says, look, the emphasis shouldn't be on the selfish gene. It should be on the selfish gene, the selfish gene. So let's have a look at some of those quotes and see what Dawkins has to say. So first, I thought this particular remark was fairly amusing. In fact, let me switch to dark on light. I don't like this, how bright the screen is. Look at that. It's like lighting up my face. I hate that. So Dawkins says this, and this is the 40th anniversary edition page. It's like with the Roman numerals, but Roman numeral 8. Many critics, especially vociferous ones learned in philosophy, as I have discovered, prefer to read the book by the title only. And I worry that something like that has gone on here with Mike Huemer. And I do hope that he gets a chance to hear what I have said now and what I'm about to say, and showing some of the quotes from the book, so that he can address whether maybe there was a misinterpretation of the book or whether he disagrees with his interpretation of the book. But when you look at the quotes I'm going to present, the suggestion that the selfish gene proposes that human behavior, it would be expected to favor selfishness from an evolutionary perspective, that's not only not true, that's the opposite of what the book argues. So let's go on and have a look at some of the other remarks he makes. And these are all from the introduction. This is also on page 8. The best way to explain the title is by locating the emphasis. Emphasize selfish, and you will think the book is about selfishness, whereas, if anything, it devotes more attention to altruism. And he goes on to say this. The correct word of the title to stress is gene, and let me explain why. A central debate within Darwinism concerns the unit that is actually selected, what kind of entity it is that survives or does not survive as a consequence of natural selection. That unit will become, more or less by definition, selfish. Altruism might well be favored at other levels. So note, that's the reason he puts the emphasis on the selfish gene. It's that what is paradoxical from Dawkins's perspective and what he argues in the book is that when you look at the behavior of animals, you do, among both humans and non-humans, see quite a bit of selfishness, but you also see altruism and self-sacrifice. And the question, one of the key questions of the book is, how do we explain that from an evolutionary perspective? Because that might seem to someone that doesn't really understand evolutionary theory very well, that might seem inconsistent with what one would expect of evolution. But as the book argues, it's not inconsistent at all. It's actually exactly what you would expect if you understand things from a gene-centric perspective. And so the idea here is that Dawkins is resolving a sort of pseudo paradox. It's not really a paradox, but the question would be, how do you get altruistic behavior if evolution is supposed to be the selfish enterprise? And the answer is it's not really selfish in some undisambiguated way. It's that you get quote unquote selfishness. This is really kind of anthropomorphic sense of selfishness because genes don't actually have attitudes or feelings at all. But natural selection, if it operates at the level of the gene, it's in a certain sense selfish at the level of the gene. And yet selfishness at the level of the gene can give rise to altruism or non-selfishness at the level of individual organisms. That is one of the key theses of the book. And for Huemer to say that we would predict selfishness from an evolutionary perspective, and so, we really struggled, we're not really able to explain human morality from an evolutionary psychological perspective. I don't think that that's true. And I think that that's a misrepresentation of what's in the book. But there's more here that I think really cements what I take to be a rather significant misinterpretation on Huemer's part about the contents of the book. So let's have a look at a couple more remarks that Dawkins makes here. So he says this: or does natural selection, as I urge here, instead choose between genes? In this case, we should not be surprised to find individual organisms behaving altruistically, quote, for the good of the genes, for example, by feeding and protecting kin who are likely to share copies of the same genes. Such kin altruism is only one way gene selfishness can translate itself into individual altruism. This book explains how it works together with reciprocation, Darwinian theory's other main generator of altruism. And so a big part of what the book talks about are two of the key factors in explaining non-selfish behavior among humans and non-human animals, which is kin selection and reciprocal altruism. So most of the book actually focuses on how that behavior makes sense in light of a gene-centric perspective on natural selection. Now, you don't have to endorse the gene-centric perspective. You don't have to agree with Dawkins about this. My problem here is that Huemer says that you learn that natural selection would predict selfish behavior, something that he goes on to say would lead us to predict that humans ought to moralize something like psychological egoism, that you would get that lesson from the selfish gene. And that is categorically false. That's the opposite of the lesson that Dawkins is talking about. Now, it is true that certain parts of the first chapter of that book, especially in the 1976 version, gave that impression. And I'm going to talk about that too. All right, here it is. He says this, and I'm going to skip over some parts of it here. He says, I do with hindsight notice lapses of my own on the very same subject. These are to be found especially in chapter 1, epitomized by the sentence, let us try to teach generosity and altruism because we are born selfish. There's nothing wrong with teaching generosity and altruism, but born selfish is misleading. And then he goes on to say at the end of that paragraph, please mentally delete that rogue sentence and others like it. So here in the introduction to this is the 40th anniversary edition, but he also does this in 30th. So it was already there about 2011, I think, when the 30th anniversary edition came out. Which doesn't make sense because the original book came out in 1976. In any case, maybe that's paperback, hardcover, I don't know. Anyway, so the point here is that he's going out of his way to say, look, I kind of gave the misleading impression in the first chapter that I'm suggesting that we should expect selfishness at the individual or organismic level. And that's not what I mean. And he actually is like, mentally delete that. Don't have that there. And he actually goes on in the audiobook version of this, which is something that I have, is he says in the audiobook version, he's actually going to skip over that line. So he's gone out of his way to say, no, that's really not what I meant. sorry if I said things that gave that impression. Then he goes on to say, he starts talking about some possible alternative titles. He suggests the altruistic vehicle would have been another possibility. No, the vehicle refers to the organism. And so he quite literally considers the altruistic, you could say individual or altruistic organism, because that's what the vehicle is, as a candidate for the title of the book. Now, it'd be very weird to look at a book called The Altruistic Vehicle. And again, with the caveat, vehicle here means like the organism or the individual, the altruistic individual, to look at a book called that and then say, this book is about selfishness, or it's an evolutionary perspective that favors selfishness. That's ridiculous. No, it doesn't. It favors the opposite of that. He also says this, another good alternative to the selfish gene would have been the cooperative gene. And so he explains why. He goes on to say, that part of the reason for this is that a big part of what he talks about, and he uses like the rowboat analogy and a few other metaphors and analogies to explain how actually it's in the interest of genes to cooperate with one another from a selfish perspective. And you could see this in everyday life with human trading. So from a purely selfish point of view, it does not turn out that the best strategy for dealing with your neighbors is to kill all of them. Sometimes your neighbors have resources, skills, or abilities that you don't have access to. And so trade is often the most effective thing. And so genes form cooperative, you could say cartels, and they work together. And so cooperation at the genetic level even arises from selfishness at the individual gene level. But all of that collectively gives rise to altruism at the level of the organism or the individual. And that's one of the core theses of the book. So it does make me wonder whether Huemer read the book a very long time ago and has a poor understanding of the central thesis. I don't know where he got this idea, but this is just not accurate. It's just not accurate. And it's not only not accurate, it's the opposite of true. And that's really frustrating because he's asked this question about whether evolution can explain human morality. And if you have a fundamental misunderstanding of what we would expect from an evolutionary perspective, and you basically say, yeah, this naive assumption, well, if that's wrong, then you could scramble to come up with these other sorts of explanations, but they're all going to be unfalsifiable. Nah, that's is not how anybody has approached the question of how you account for altruism among humans for literally decades. So I don't know where he's getting this from. This is just very inaccurate. Okay, let me have a look at the comments. All right. Oh, it looks like my throat cleared up too. That's good. Luisi Barra says, I found your videos from Unsolicited Advice's video. I've watched a lot of them. Oh, very cool. Nice. Thank you. All right. Sophia, thanks for welcoming Lewis. All right. Cool. And they go on to say, definitely what I've come to understand, thanks to your fabulous explanations, is that metaethics should be the central theme in moral debates. At least that's what I managed to understand so far. Well, I would like it to be, because that's what I want to talk about, but I don't know if it always should be. All right. Jonah says, it seems like the selfish gene is well equipped to explain the popular intuition that we have a special obligation towards kin. Yeah, it doesn't do a bad job. So, yeah. Matthias asks, hey, Lance, do you have any recommendations in evolutionary theory? Always found it fascinating, but I don't know where to even begin. Yeah, I think the selfish gene is a good place to start. The extended phenotype is really cool. That's his follow-up book. It's a bit of a tougher to get through. I really love, probably my second favorite book from Dawkins is The Ancestor's Tale. It's a bigger book. I think he might have called it, or maybe it said a blurb on the book or something like his magnum opus or something like that. It's a big book, but it's worth giving a go. I just found that one to be a lot of fun to read. The Greatest Show on Earth is good. He has a bunch of other books. So I think Dawkins is good on evolution, but don't limit yourself to a Dawkins only perspective. Richardson and Boyd are good on gene culture, coevolution. So have a look at their books. I think the book is Not by Genes Alone. That's a really good book. Kim Sterelny, The Evolved Apprentice, had a big influence on me. He has at least one new book out, which I've had my eye on for a while that I haven't had a look at. And that one's, but The Evolved Apprentice is really good. It's a relatively short book, and it's very cool. So check that one out. So any stuff on gene culture, coevolution, stuff on really understanding evolution at a fundamental level. I'm sure I haven't really kept up to date with a lot of books. I'm sure there's more stuff out there that you could find that's quite good that I don't know about. I'm trying to remember uh, other stuff that I've read. I wouldn't. I would be cautious about getting too caught up in pop science descriptions of evolution, because a lot of science, a lot of where things are at is in journals, and it's going to be distributed across articles, and a lot of that, when it is condensed and distilled into popular science, you're only getting the perspective of the handful of science popularizers. And for every, just to make up random numbers, who knows what it would be, but every 200 or 300 uh, academics that do really serious work in a field, there might be one or two of them that is a prominent science popularizer, and any biases that they have, or any predilections they have for favoring one perspective over another, that's going to be filtered through their work. And so you're getting a very narrow lens into the world of whatever's happening in science. And often those popularized books, they might present the pet theories of the particular scientist in question. They might not even be written by a scientist, which doesn't necessarily make them bad, but sometimes it's an indicator that they might not be as well versed in the field as they ought to be. Sometimes you're going to get something where you're getting the mainstream perspective instead of a less mainstream perspective, and often the less mainstream perspective is a sort of up and coming view that's actually better or strong, or like a stronger view. Often there's a bit of a lag between popular science and the cutting edge research. I shouldn't say often, pretty much always there's going to be. It's very hard to get the popular science out ahead of all the science that's being produced, because some of it is going to be like preprints and stuff like that. So if you really want to get your head in the game, you might want to find some sort of like classic articles, like journal articles. Uh, as far as how to recommend those, I don't even know where to start. I personally, I haven't read a ton of articles on evolutionary theory. Some of them have come up in some of the stuff that I've read, so it's not like I haven't read any, but it's not a topic I specialize in by any means. So it depends on whether you want the popular science version, or you want, like the deep science stuff. I'd also say that there's a lot of new stuff. People have been sort of chipping away at the sort of view that Dawkins helped mainstream decades ago. Some of it might not be so great. Some of it probably has quite a bit of merit. And so what I would say is, don't rely on me, because this is an area where my reading stagnated, you know, a long time ago. And there's probably new stuff out that's better than what I've read, or that really updates and changes the landscape quite a bit. And I don't know what all of that looks like. So find someone that knows more. Oh, I do have a recommendation. So one of my favorite, it might be my number one favorite channel on YouTube, is Gutsick Gibbon. And so she's an anthropologist, or anthropologist, primatologist. Oh, I'm gonna get it wrong. I hope I didn't get it wrong. Anyway, so she talks about evolution a lot on her channel. She is I think I heard someone describe her as a fire hose of information, and it's just a glorious channel. Her enthusiasm is amazing. Her depth of knowledge is just incredible. Her fluidity in spitting things out. She's not going like me. She's always got flow and energy. So she's just got a phenomenal channel, and that is what I would recommend starting with. It's very likely that she can give you way, way, way better recommendations than me. Is vastly, or like orders of magnitude more knowledgeable than me. So Gutsick Gibbon, go check out her channel. It's just freaking awesome. So that's what I would recommend as your starting point, and then whatever she recommends, go read that. All right. I should have just led with that. Just go check out Gutsick Gibbon's channel, get some recommendations over there. And there's probably a community and people, I don't know, comments, posts. There's got to be a way of getting access to resources from there that are going to be better than what I could give you. Hudson says, this is unrelated, but a while back you talked about a paper, Mongolian metaethical categories, but I can't find the right video. Yeah, I know the paper. Give me 1 second, and I'll pull it up and I'll put it in the chat. All right. That is the paper. Bernie Eunice. I don't know how to pronounce this, but Mongolian Yos Sertikun and Weird Morality, Journal of Cultural Cognitive Science. There you go. Check that out. It's a really cool paper. All right. Was this before I said that? Yeah, it must have been because that was more than 5 minutes ago. Always Better says, I've also seen Lance recommend Gutsick Gibbon, mentioning her here in case he doesn't mention her. Yeah, I started on this. So Hudson adds, she's doing an excellent series of Will Duffy going through basically every facet of evolution, starting from the basics. It's wonderful. It is outrageously in depth and super duper mega long. Like they're going to go from the beginning all the way to the end on evolution from the ground up. That is going to be absolutely glorious. And I already started it. It's already great. And that whole thing, like finding out who Will Duffy is and what he's done and how he got involved in that, it's cool. It's going to be a fun ride. So go over there and check that out. That's the place to go. All right. That answers all the questions. Cool. All right. So let's keep going with the video.
Okay. Basically, okay, the group selection model is wrong. Evolution does not select for behaviors that benefit the group.
I know we're repeating.
Right. It selects for behaviors that benefit the individual, or more specifically, that benefit the particular gene that's being selected. So the genes tend to predominate in the population when that gene causes individuals who have that gene to produce more copies of it. Okay. So now if you just understand that, then what you would anticipate from people's moral values is you would think that everyone should be an ethical egoist.
Right. Yeah. So as I said, you wouldn't predict that. It's not true.
Ethical egoism is a view in ethics that the right thing to do is always the thing that most serves your own interests. So you'd expect that people would have something like that view, or maybe, even more, you'd expect them to have the view that the good is reproduction. That everybody's main goal in life should be to produce as many offspring as possible.
No particular reason to think that that's what people would favor from an adaptive perspective.
Nobody holds that view. And very few people hold ethical egoism. And most people think that egoism is like a complete non-starter. Okay. So like the thing that you would most likely expect if an evolutionary account of our moral beliefs were correct is pretty close to the opposite of what people actually think.
Yeah. So again, as I said, humans evolved to develop cultures, and there's this gene culture coevolutionary process going on. We are adapted to basically picking up information from the people around us. And that, for better or worse, can lead to a whole bunch of behavior that is maladaptive, and natural selection can still favor a tendency to be a cultural organism. So, once you open yourself up to having a brain that says, hey, instead of sort of preloading all the values, concerns, cares, attitudes, behaviors, dispositions, and everything, what I'm going to do is there might be a little bit of preloaded stuff. There might be a bit of canalization that leads me towards being restricted in what I could learn and what I couldn't learn, and how I could be or how I couldn't be. You're not going to convince too many people that they should only eat dirt and they shouldn't like honey or chocolate or fatty things or potato chips. Of course, they're going to like those. So certain sorts of things are going to be relatively structured into there. But there's a whole lot of wiggle room, and that wiggle room is fleshed out by culture. And so that leaves a lot of room for all sorts of stuff to come in from culture. And as long as overall being a cultural organism, the kind of organism that picks up a culture from the people around you, as long as that tendency is adaptive, then natural selection will favor it, even if there are local instances in which culture ends up being maladaptive. So take populations in which whole communities dedicated themselves to celibacy, or they joined like a weird death cult and they all died. Well, that might not have been particularly adaptive for those groups. Does that mean that we should then turn around and say, wow, so it's not adaptive to be a cultural organism, to be the sort of organism receptive to and cognitively structured to pick up a culture? No, because all that matters is that on average, organisms that have the associated cluster of genes that make them these culture sponges, as long as that's enhances your reproductive fitness on average, then it will be favored. It doesn't matter if some organisms it doesn't work out for them. So, just to give you a physiological comparison to illustrate the point, a particular adaptation doesn't have to be always adaptive in all circumstances. So take an organism that is adapted to being camouflaged. So it's adaptive to be, brown, and it lives in like a wooded region. Well, if some of those organisms happen to get pushed out into an open plains where it's green, the grass is green, and the grass is like dry part of the year and it's kind of a beige color, they might be very conspicuous and they might get killed. Does that mean that being brown isn't adaptive for that organism? No, because it's adaptive in the typical environment that they're in. It could also be that certain sorts of characteristics sometimes can harm you. So organisms, like a big organism, might just be too big and get stuck somewhere and die. Does that mean it's not adaptive for members of that species to typically be big? No. Just because a trait happens to go badly for some members of a species doesn't really matter from an adaptive perspective. What matters is if organisms with that phenotype on average leave behind more offspring than ones that don't have the phenotype. And the same would be true for humans. So as long as on average culture tends to be adaptive to have, humans are going to continue having culture, even if culture is sometimes maladaptive. So it would then be the case, or one might ask, well, is it possible that the moral standards that certain communities of humans have are actually maladaptive? Yes, it is. And that's not a contradiction with evolution. But then if you turn around and say, okay, but actually this culture is adaptive, great. That's not inconsistent either. So what really matters is averages, and looking at the kinds of values humans have. It's not so clear that the moral values people have, like cooperate with one another, kindness, generosity, self-sacrifice, don't murder, don't lie, don't steal. It's not so clear that that's maladaptive. If it was, arguably, it would be a sign of local maladaptation as a result of a sort of a cultural dead end, a dead end from a cultural perspective. That doesn't necessarily mean that being a cultural organism is, on average, not in the reproductive interest of the genes of the organisms that tend to produce culture vehicles. If we're looking at this from a gene-centric perspective. So, and this is assuming we're only looking at it from a gene-centric perspective. If you start bringing in multi-level selection, things here are going to change, and at least some evolutionary biologists are going to want to favor these multi-level selection models that are going to have even less trouble accounting for this. So, this idea that we should expect selfishness or a preoccupation with reproduction, or that evolution has some super difficult challenges with explaining our moral values, no, it doesn't. And a lot of stuff, when an organism is adapted to being cultural, you're not going to be able to read off the particular idiosyncrasies of the culture from the genes. You wouldn't be able to predict what languages people would speak from looking at our genes. Does that mean that we don't have languages, or that we can't account for languages without invoking heavy duty metaphysics, that we can't account for it? No, we could account for language, if not from biology, then from culture. It's not like people are using some special intuition faculty to recognize the true words of the correct language to speak. No, languages are just these local idiosyncratic weird things. You wipe out human populations, they'd come up with different languages. You wouldn't be able to predict the particular sports that we would play. You wouldn't be able to predict that humans would play chess in particular. So what? Does that mean chess, or we're correctly recognizing these stance-independent facts about the true rules of chess? No. Humans are cultural organisms. We construct and we create behavior categories and types. They wouldn't be easy to predict from looking at our genes alone. You have to look at the culture. And once you start looking at cultures, explaining why humans would have the moral values that they have by looking at their culture, I don't see what's so mysterious or difficult to do in that regard. We wouldn't need to posit people somehow detecting or picking up on, or having some special faculty for discerning objective moral truth in order to explain why humans have moral values. I don't think that's particularly mysterious at all, why humans have the moral values that they have.
That's not to say that you can't then come up with some explanation for why it wouldn't be what you would initially expect. Okay, but then that just kind of shows that it's like an unfalsifiable theory.
How does it show that it's an unfalsifiable theory? So Huemer comes at this with basic, I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but naive assumptions about what you would expect from evolution. And if your naive assumptions are wrong, and someone goes, no, evolution doesn't have these naive predictions, it actually has these more sophisticated explanations about what you would expect, that somehow shows it's unfalsifiable. Why? So people have certain sorts of naive assumptions about physics. And so Newton comes along and says, no, it's not quite like that. And then Einstein comes along and says, Newton, it's not even quite like that. There's actually more nuances. There's more unexpected and odd things. Does that mean that our modern theories of physics are unfalsifiable because they don't comport with our initial presumptions? Of course not. The fact that someone could sit down and explain, no, actually, natural selection doesn't predict psychological ego. It doesn't predict egoism. It doesn't predict a specific preoccupation with reproduction. It doesn't actually predict those things. And I can explain why it actually predicts what we observe. That doesn't, how does that make it unfalsifiable? The question of whether it's unfalsifiable or not would turn on whether there are actual predictions or phenomena that you could point to that would be able to show, no, that's actually wrong. That's a separate question from whether you're able to propose an explanation. So the fact that you can propose explanations doesn't automatically entail that they're unfalsifiable. I don't know where he's getting that from.
Like you can come up with some story for how evolution could select almost.
Yeah. I mean, does Huemer think kin selection is just some story? Does he think reciprocal altruism is just some story? Just stories. Like scientists just tell stories. These aren't testable. I don't know what he's basing this on. He's framing this almost as though here's what the books say, and now you could come up with an explanation, but this like strained, just some story that you come up with, and that doesn't even remotely accurately characterize 20th century biology, much less what's gone on the past quarter of a century since then. I don't know where he's getting this from.
Anything, right? But it doesn't. We don't have the thing you would most naturally expect, right?
Why should we care what Huemer would most naturally expect? It's certainly not what the book would suggest that we should naturally expect. It's not what I would naturally expect. I don't know that I would have very strong intuitions about what to expect in the first place, but those expectations could easily be overturned by thinking a bit about the topic. This is how people figured out, like, kin selection isn't something someone only was like, oh, wait a minute. From a gene-centric perspective, I could only figure this out after tons and tons of studies. You could sit down and think about this. I didn't come up with it. I wasn't around, and I doubt I would have been the person to figure it out. But evolutionary theorists theorize, and they can figure things out, and they're not just telling stories.
So you can't sort of unless you're already somehow independently committed to thinking that it's got to be evolution, that morality has to be an adaptation. There's not any obvious reason for thinking that it is.
Oh, well, now he's saying morality is an adaptation. I don't even think morality is an adaptation. I think it's a cultural construction. So there's a great paper called Evolution and Morality by Mashry and Malin. And what they argue in there, and I've probably talked about this in the channel a few times, is say, look, the claim that morality evolved is actually ambiguous, and there's at least three ways you could disambiguate it. One is that some of the psychological processes involved in moral cognition are themselves the product of natural selection. And they say, yeah, that might be true. For any given one of these, it might be kind of hard to show that particular process was a part of was selected for. But notably, for all of those characteristics, they would each have their own sort of evolutionary history, their own selective drives that led to the development of that particular adaptation. And that could include things like emotion, which is clearly involved in morality, and other sorts of characteristics or attributes that people have that might be involved in moral judgment. The point here is that they might be involved in other stuff. They're not distinctively moral. So emotions didn't evolve specifically to facilitate moral cognition. They do other things. So one way of disambiguating morality evolved is that some of the processes involved in morality were themselves a product of natural selection. Might be true, but it doesn't really show that morality as a distinctive type of as a distinctive type of cognition evolved. Next, as they say, you might think, well, normative cognition evolved. So thinking in terms of prescriptions, in terms of shoulds and shouldn'ts, think in terms of deontic terminology, all of that may be a product of natural selection. And they say, yeah, there's pretty good evidence that humans might have evolved to have normative predispositions. But then there's the question of, well, what about a distinctive type of normative disposition, moral cognition? And they give Richard Joyce's a cluster of characteristics. I don't remember them offhand, but authority, independence, maybe. It's a few things that make it look pretty robust. I don't remember exactly what's on the list, and I don't feel like pulling it up. I have the book chapter, but I don't want to do it. So it's basically this cluster of what you could call a nomological cluster of characteristics that would distinguish distinctively moral norms from non-moral norms. And you could suggest that humans have a distinctive capacity for thinking in moral normative terms, and that we have some sort of cognitive system that comes online that facilitates that. And what they argue is there's actually not a lot of evidence that that's true. So you could look at things like the moral conventional distinction, the work pioneered by Turiel and colleagues. Now, I don't even think that they argue that it's some sort of innate system, but other people have interpreted it as this innate system. And I don't think there's good evidence of that. So why isn't there good evidence of that? Because There's a lot of evidence that it doesn't reliably emerge in every culture, that it very well might likely be, although early emerging, still a product of culture. The point here is that, well, what is moral thinking in particular? I think it's a type of normative cognition that only arose in some cultures and not others. So I agree with Mashry in another paper he has called Morality, a Historical Invention. So I don't think moral cognition is a product of biological evolution. I think it's a product of cultural evolution in conjunction with certain aspects of biological evolution. So I think it's a cultural construction, kind of like chess or speaking English. These are not direct products of natural selection. They're culturally selected. They're culturally have arisen and been passed on from one generation to the next. So we can explain why people have the moral dispositions and tendencies that they have by looking at culture. All right. Duxy says, I saw some theists getting chewed up on atheism in a debate show. As an atheist, though, I felt sort of outside of it. But sometimes point nomology seems like teleological evidencing sometimes to evolution. Oops. I don't know where you're going with that. But hey, I felt like reading it. Okay, let's keep going.
Okay, so where morality come from? Because William Craig would say, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Would you agree with that?
No, that's close to the opposite of the truth. No, I mean, it's not the opposite of the truth. I mean, objective moral values can coexist with God, but William Lane Craig's view is not a moral realist view. Okay, it is not embracing objective values. It's a subjectivist view, because his view and the view of these other, divine command theorists is that morality depends on the attitudes of God. Okay, God is an interesting special observer, but he's an observer. So it's holding that moral values depend on the attitudes of the observer. So it's holding that they're not objective. Okay, now we moral realists believe, like the hardcore, robust moral realists think that morality is objective in a strong sense. It's independent of the attitudes of any observers.
Now, this is something that I'm on the fence about. I've seen some remarks from Craig that look like he is an anti-realist, and then I've seen remarks that look like he's a realist. So I'm not quite sure what's going on with Craig. As far as other proponents of divine command theory, I've talked to some people that really are more knowledgeable about this, and what they've told me is that Christians that worry about metaethics are aware. They've certainly heard of the Euthyphro problem before, and they're aware of the accusation that grounding morality in God poses this apparent issue of looking like it renders their position an anti-realist position, that it makes the moral facts contingent on God's standards or attitudes. And what I've been told is they have workarounds for this, that they actively attempt to resist this. And so you might think that the workarounds don't work, but that's beside the point. The positions, arguably, for at least some of the proponents of these views, are by stipulation realist positions. They are saying, hey, I think that there are stance independent moral facts. I don't think that it's just some direct matter, some direct through line of God thinks something is right or wrong that makes it right or wrong. So I'd have to confirm. Maybe I need to get somebody in the channel to talk about this, but my impression is that proponents of divine command theory, at least some of them, are not anti-realists. They are realists, and they make some moves for why they're realists and they're not really anti-realists. So I am a bit concerned when people claim this, and I know I've claimed it in the past that divine command theory is a type of anti-realism. I'm not so sure about that. I think it's just going to depend on the type of theorist and what exactly they think,
including God. Okay, now some of these religious divine command theorist thinkers, I think they just cannot comprehend that that's anybody's view. Like, they're such deeply committed subjectivists that they cannot comprehend what an actual moral realist view is. So they don't realize that that's actually the view, right? So like they don't understand, like, well, they're like, but where could morality come from? To me, that's a bizarre question. It's like asking where the number 2 comes from, right? Or, so the fact that it's wrong to cause suffering for no reason, or, to cause suffering to others just for the fun of it, where does that fact come from? That's like asking where the fact that 2 is less than 3 comes from. I have no idea what that means. That's like, okay. But I think the reason was, and nobody asked.
I will note, people give me a hard time about saying I don't know what stuff means, but Huemer's doing it here. So if it's okay for Huemer to do it, I should be able to do it.
That question. Nobody asked, where does 2 is less than 3 come from? Right. But that's because most people are realists about math. Okay.
Most people are realists about math. You heard him say it. Is that true? Let's do a poll. Oh, I gotta actually be in the video to do it. Give me 1 second. I want to find out what you think if most people are realists about math. Maybe you'll think they are. Let's see. All right, we've got a poll going, and go ahead and vote. All right, let's keep going.
But then somehow they think that morality is very different. And I don't know why. I don't know why anyone thinks that it's sensible to ask where the moral truths come from, right? When they don't ask that about other necessary truths, right?
Right. Wouldn't you say that if moral realism is true, then it would raise probability for theism? Because if God created and ordered the cosmos, arranging it such that we as rational beings can apprehend non-physical entities like moral norms, that would be strange, right? Richard Swinburne would put that argument. What do you think?
Well, okay, so it's not simply the existence of moral truths, but our ability to perceive them or our ability to know the moral truths. Is that evidence for theism? It's probably a small amount of evidence for theism, right? Like it's probably more likely that we would have that capacity if there's a God than if there isn't. The reason for that being that I suppose it's good that we're able to perceive the moral truths. That causes us to behave better than we would if we couldn't perceive the moral truths. So that's good. So there's evidence for theism in the way that everything good is evidence for theism. At the same time, bear in mind that everything bad is evidence against theism by the same token for the same reason, right?
Can't say I really disagree with him about that. That might be true.
So, okay. So, overall, it's not a huge amount. Now you might think, okay, but, is it a lot more likely or a little bit more likely that we would have moral knowledge if there was a God? That sort of like depends upon your understanding of how moral knowledge works. Okay, so if you think that human beings have a completely separate cognitive faculty for perceiving moral truths and only moral truths, right? Then that's a bit odd. And then theism starts to look like an explanation for why we have that faculty. Or, you start looking at evolution, like why would evolution select for that faculty? And then you're like not completely clear why it would. Okay, but that isn't the view of most contemporary moral realists. Most contemporary moral realists think that we have a general capacity for understanding necessary truths, for understanding abstract objects. And so the way that you're able to do mathematics is that you're able to grasp certain abstract objects, certain abstractions, like the number 3 is an abstraction. It's an abstract object. And because you're able to understand what it is, you're able to understand what 3-ness is, or the property of being triple or whatever. Because you're able to understand that, then you can also understand how it relates to other things, like that it's more than 2, right? Or understand properties of it like that it's prime. Okay. And I think most contemporary moral realists believe that moral properties are also abstract objects, which we can grasp through the same cognitive faculty through a
This just like we have a cognitive faculty for grasping necessary truths. What is the faculty? How does that work? And how do we know which things are members of it and which things aren't members of it? And how do we know morality is of the same kind as judgments about mathematics? What is the story here from an evolutionary and just from a straightforwardly cognitive, sort of like functional perspective? What is this for? What does it do? And how do we know we have it? How does it work?
Capacity for understanding natures of abstract objects, and thereby you can understand necessary truths about them. That enjoyment is better than suffering. So that's a necessary truth. If you understand the nature of enjoyment and you understand what suffering is, and you understand what goodness is, then you just inherently.
Yeah, and I think anti-realists are going to have pretty straightforward answers to all of this sorts of stuff. So things that I like more are things that I like more than things that I like less, like trivially. Sure. Oh, but hey, that relies on certain sorts of like logical relations, and so there's necessary truths anyway. I don't think any of these truths are necessary, so I don't really think that we have this ability to recognize necessary truths. I think all of these things, including mathematics, are constructed by humans. So, Huemer and I have such a radically different perspective on what's going on with human cognition. and what it is that we're recognizing or able to do when we think about things.
I have to understand that enjoyment is better than suffering. Right. So, okay. So like we didn't have to have, okay. So like, it's not, honestly, it's not weird that you can understand moral truths. Right. And,
I think, I think it's weird. I do think it's weird. Well, the idea that there's a lot of unanswered questions here. I'm not trying to make like a Mackey kind of claim. In a certain sense, I would make one of them, which is if we had a capacity for grasping necessary truths, and some of those truths are moral truths, how do we know that we have that capacity? How does it work? How do we figure out that we have it? How do we know when it's accurate or inaccurate? How does it function? In the case of visual perception or other sorts of perception of, the objects that you would pick out by the sciences, we have ways of independently corroborating whether we have accurate perceptions of them. How does this work with morality? And how does it work with anything else? I don't know. I don't know what the story is there. I don't think that Huemer and others that believe in like substantive a priori truths are going to think that these kinds of truths can even be subjected in principle to that sort of inquiry, because that would in a certain sense make them amenable to empirical inquiry, and then they wouldn't be so a priori in the first place. So, the way he approaches things, it just seems like there's this whole ghost corpus of facts that I just don't think that there's any way to epistemically access them in the first place.
Given that you could understand other abstract objects, it's not weird.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't buy it. I don't buy that story that you can grasp other abstract objects and this one just gets to come along for the ride. Why and how do we know that? What is that based on? What if we came across a population of philosophers that had split off from, I don't know, they hung out with Parmenides or something back in the day, and they split off and they did philosophy in a remote island for the past, 2400, 2700, whenever Parmenides was around years, 2400 years, whatever it would be, right? And they, in addition to thinking that there are these abstract necessary truths about mathematics or maybe logic, they thought that there were abstract necessary truths about some totally exotic category. And it's not even like a normative category. It could be, anaximatic truths or Democritean truths. Like just pick some weird term or based on some pre-Socratic philosopher or something. They just think there's this other category of truths. And they're all like, they would report. And again, if this is facilitated by if this is culturally acquired capacity, then they would all report things like, oh yeah, we have access to these truths. They're necessary truths. Hey, Joe, it's obvious to you, right? Oh yeah, no, it's obvious to me too. How would we be able to show in principle that they were incorrect about this? I think the answer is we couldn't. There is no way of externally corroborating which alleged necessary truths belong in the category of these abstract truths one's capable of allegedly grasping. Anybody in any community could purport to grasp some set of abstract truths, no matter how exotic, no matter how bizarre, no matter how ridiculous the content of the truths. And there would be no way to show that those people were wrong. All we would have is their assurances that they're able to grasp these truths. That's it. That's all you have. There's no external means of corroborating the reality of those truths. Now, part of the reason I don't have a problem with math is because I think math earns its keep from a pragmatic perspective. So it's, people have given examples like this before, but you're not going to do very well if you see 3 bears go into a cave, you see 2 leave, and you assume there's no bears in there, and you go into the cave. Now you're going to die. So we wouldn't, if math didn't work, we wouldn't be able to land probes on Mars. So math does work. It earns its keep. Now I know that there's a bunch of theoretical and weird parts of math that may or may not be able to be practically implemented, and maybe there's going to be some issues with that. But when insofar as morality or other sorts of philosophical matters are construed in terms of these abstract necessary truths, how do they earn their keep? I think the answer is they don't. They don't actually do anything, because everything that could be done by appeal to those facts could be done without appeal to those facts. They are, from a sort of deliberative and practical perspective, completely superfluous. They do nothing at all. I don't need them, and I can navigate the world perfectly fine. And so I think, from a pragmatic perspective, that's pretty much all I need to jettison them. But the people that hold these views don't think that the test for whether something is true is a pragmatic test. The position is sort of self-justifying. They think the test is whether or not it's the product of the exercise of this faculty, which I'm questioning whether they even have it. And if, if I say, but what's the empirical evidence you have it? And then someone says, yeah, but it's not an empirical matter. I don't know what to do at that point. So philosophers can claim to have this ability, and it's unclear how anybody on the outside that isn't already part of the people that accept the legitimacy of the ability, what evidence could be presented to me from Huemer to show that Huemer has this ability? What could he do in principle? Because all I have are self-reports from Huemer and others. That, as far as I can tell, that's it. That's all they have. And that doesn't strike me as any better than if we ran into like a weird group in the woods that claimed that they could communicate with beings on the opposite end of the universe. We wouldn't be able to confirm or disconfirm. So how would we? Maybe they could. I would just, let's not rule it out. But how is that any less? Huemer complains about the evolutionary explanations being unfalsifiable. So, if you just say, hey, my position is unfalsifiable, but it's outside the realm of science, so I'm not even playing that game, haha. It's like a cheat code for automatically winning at rendering your position unassailable from an empiricist perspective. I have a problem with that. That doesn't seem like, to me, like a good way to do things. So, when I say it doesn't seem that way, what I mean is, from a pragmatic perspective, it doesn't seem like a pragmatic way to do things. But if that's not the game Huemer's playing, we are playing fundamentally different games. Like, I'm trying to be a pragmatist and he's just not. And I don't know what to do at that point. Then we just have radically different approaches to philosophy, and I don't know how to resolve them. And I think the answer is we can't resolve them. We're just doing different things. That's what I think is going on. Yeah, Eric Wales here says truth tingles. I really want to popularize that. This idea that philosophers have intuitions and they can recognize these abstract necessary truths. I think we should call intuitions, when philosophers use them in these ways, we should call them truth tingles.
That's why I like your approach, because you simply don't care if that's evidence for God or against God. So you are good with both. So, okay. How would you answer? How would you respond to the argument from disagreement? Many philosophers argue that the widespread moral disagreement undermines moral realism, and that shows that morality is subjective.
So before he answers, I'll just say what I think. There's widespread disagreement about all sorts of things: the shape of the Earth, the age of the Earth, whether evolution happened or not. There's scientific disagreements. There's disagreements among experts within fields. None of that is by itself a good indication that there's no objective fact of the matter, or stance independent fact of the matter. But proponents of arguments from disagreement can say more than that. They wouldn't just point to the mere presence of, that would be like a super like level 1 version of this argument. Hey, I observe the mere presence of disagreement. That's evidence of anti-realism. I mean, it might be a little bit of evidence, but it's not particularly good evidence. The better evidence is going to come from epistemic peers. So if you think that other people are your epistemic peers and they disagree, that should be better evidence. If you think experts can't agree, that's better evidence. So really what it's going to come down to is a better argument from disagreement. It's going to be an abductive argument that says, what is the best explanation, not simply for why people disagree, but why these disagreements appear to be intractable. And one might put forward the hypothesis that the best explanation is that people are unable to come to an agreement because there's no fact of the matter to agree on. So that's what better versions of the argument would look like. And then they would proceed to talk about, they would examine the various sorts of moral epistemologies that have been put forward by realists, and then show how they're inadequate, how they don't really adequately satisfy this question of, okay, well, if there were moral truths, how would we come by them? How would we acquire this knowledge? And so it's really best construed as part of a broader project of demonstrating the collective inadequacy of various types of realist moral epistemologies, and showing how, on abductive grounds, the seeming intractability of moral disputes, the actual intractability so far of moral disputes is best explained by positing some type of anti-realism.
Yeah. I mean, one thing is that I think the amount of disagreement is exaggerated. Some of the apparent moral disagreement is factual.
I totally agree with him about this.
Disagreement. So you take issues like whether abortion is morally wrong. Is it wrong to abort a fetus? And, that could be partly a moral disagreement, but it's also partly a factual disagreement. So part of the reason why people disagree about that is people disagree about whether fetuses have souls. So many, maybe most, like maybe the vast majority of the people who are against abortion think that a fetus has a soul, that the soul enters the body like at the moment of conception or sometime very early during the pregnancy. And the people who are against abortion think that does not happen. Okay, so it's partly a matter of factual disagreement. And by the way, like, nobody says that shows that there aren't any facts about souls. There's disagreement about whether we have a soul and when it enters the body, if it does. Nobody says that means that there's no objective fact about whether you have a soul or not. Right?
You might get a couple weirdos, but yeah, I agree with him about that. And he makes an excellent point here, which is, take all the people that are pro-choice, or they want people to have access to abortion. If they were absolutely convinced that fetuses have souls, and they have souls, like let's say from the moment of conception, um, there's a soul there. I would be surprised if a lot of people didn't flip and go, all right, we probably shouldn't be aborting them unless there's a very good reason, like it endangers the life of the mother or something like that. Uh, so I do think a lot of people switch. I don't think all of them would. I think some people would say, yeah, well, okay, we could just wipe out some souls once in a while. So I do think people would make that argument anyway. And part of the reason I think that is because the main argument that pro-choice activists make is not an appeal to, well, it's not conscious yet, and so there's no moral issue prior to consciousness. I've always thought that that's probably one of the stronger arguments for the permissibility of abortion in the first trimester, is that the fetus is unlikely to be conscious. But it's not typically what you get. What you typically get is bodily autonomy appeals. And even if you look at the prominent work in bioethics, they'll often proceed from the assumption, yeah, okay, let's suppose they're people and they're conscious. It's still okay to get an abortion, at least up until a certain point. And I do think at least some people are quite committed to that. And I don't think that they would care much if they wouldn't be moved by the fact that they have souls as well. I don't think. So I'm not saying everybody. I'm saying a lot of people would switch or pivot to being pro-life if they thought fetuses have souls, and a lot of people wouldn't. So,
right. So like, it's a little bit odd that people say that about moral disagreements that they don't say about other kinds of disagreements. The other thing that we should think about is there's been a lot of disagreement in history over moral questions as well as other kinds of questions, but also societies have tended to converge over history on many different things, including moral values. Okay, so the values of people today are different from the values that they had thousands of years ago.
Let's pick up this argument in the next iteration of the video. I'm getting a little tired here. So this is it looks like he's moving towards the argument for moral convergence, and we'll save that for another video. All right, everybody, I am going to wrap things up there. Have a good night, and yeah, enjoy the holidays. You probably won't see me before Christmas, so Merry Christmas, everybody. I hope you have a good one. We're going to do a barbecue. We got a lot of good stuff. But I'm making turtle cookies. So they're not made with turtle, it's caramel. So that's going to be fun. What else am I making? I wasn't conscripted to do a lot of stuff. I'm going to be grilling and making some cookies, but a lot of the other people are making other stuff. But anyway, so we are going to have a great Christmas. I hope you do too. And I'll probably see you before the new year. I'll be on a bit of a break. I'll be busy anyway, but anyway, at this point, I'm just procrastinating on getting out of here. Eric Will says, hope you have a great Christmas. You too. All right, everybody. I will stop procrastinating and just get out of here. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment in the comment section. I'll pin the best comment. If there's something that I should be pinning there, I'll do it. If you go leave a comment on this discussion with Huemer, do be nice. I really don't want to encourage people to be jerks. I hope Huemer will take my criticisms in the spirit of caring about what's true and not in the spirit of like hostility or something like that, because it's not at all intended. One thing I like to say about Huemer is that he's incredibly gracious with his time. For people, a lot of people in the comments I see are very critical of Huemer. They don't seem to like him very much a lot of the time. When we had a discussion, he was not only very engaged in the discussion, but he was very generous with his time and quite engaging to talk to outside of that discussion. Of course, I'm not going to give any details of what we talked about. But for someone that is busy, and philosophers have, they work like anybody else, and maybe he's not quite his position as a young career philosopher where he's got to publish or all is lost. Still, he makes time to go out and speak to people about his views in a way that I don't see a lot of people do. And he's willing to go on the smallest channels. He's not out there chasing fame and glory. He's out there because he likes talking about this stuff, and he's willing to talk about it. And however critical of you are of him, he deserves a lot of credit for that. People that are willing to take time out of their day to talk to anybody, pretty much anybody. I think if I invited him on my channel, he would agree. I think if a channel had 10 subscribers, he would go in the channel. I think that's awesome. And I think that's laudable. And, if you can't give people you're critical of credit where credit is due, you're being a jerk. And I don't want to encourage that in this channel. So you should give him credit for that. All right, everybody. I will catch y'all later. Take care.
Bye.